Shabbat Shalom, everyone. First of all, we were going to record this in our sukkah, and it was got a little chilly outside, and it was a little bit too cold for us to record out there. So you don't get to see the sukkah in the background. So I apologize for that. Point number two is I had to go back and re-record this after our fellowship gathering with all of the discussions. We realized you could not hear what was going on with what some of the people were saying. So I apologize now that you don't get to hear all of the side discussions that were going on and you just get me. So I'm just going to go through the teaching. This Shabbat, we are covering just the regular, just talking about Sukkot. First of all, we had quite a few people who have never done Sukkot with us before, so they are a few who are not real familiar with it. So we wanted to just go through a basic teaching on Sukkot. So first of all, Hag Sukkot, the festival of Sukkot, is the seventh Moedim or seventh appointed time. And it's known by quite a few names. One of the names is Feast of Tabernacles. It's also called the Feast of Booths because you're building a sukkah. It's a booth. It's called the Feast of Ingathering because it's the time of ingathering and bringing the harvest. And it's also called Zaman Simhatenu, which is the time of our rejoicing. And there are many symbols and pictures hidden within this appointed time. And we can only really scrape the surface as there's so many different layers and different meanings that you can really start going into. But I first want to go to Numbers 15, because as we are talking about these feasts, sometimes the question comes up as to why should it be important to us as a believer? And so really, I wanted to go to Numbers 15:15. And it says, "For this community, there will be the same law for you as the foreigner living with you. This is a permanent regulation through all of your generations. The foreigner is to be treated the same way before Yah as yourselves. So the same Torah and standard of judgment will apply to both you and the foreigner living with you." So these Moedim, these appointed times, as I said before, are not Jewish appointed times. In Leviticus 23 and verse 1, he says these are the feast of the Lord, not Jewish feast. So these are his feast. And if we notice what I just read here, these feasts, these Moedim, are for the native born as well as the foreigner. And it tells us here that the same Torah was to apply to them too. So they weren't to be treated differently. It doesn't make a difference whether you were born physically from one of the tribes of Israel or you were grafted in. You were treated exactly the same. Now, Sukkot occurs early fall in the year, and it's on the 15th day of the seventh month on Yah's biblical calendar, 15 days after Yom Teruah, which is the day of blowing of the shofar, and 5 days after Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So let's go to Leviticus 23 and let's start reading. In Leviticus 23:33, Yah said to Moshe, "Tell the people of Israel, on the 15th day of the seventh month is the feast of Sukkot, for 7 days to Yah. On the first day, there is to be a holy convocation. Do not do any ordinary kind of work. And for 7 days, you are to bring an offering made by fire to Yah. On the 8th day, you are to have a holy convocation and bring an offering made by fire to Yah. It is a day of public assembly, and do not do any ordinary kind of work. These are the designated times of Yah that you are to proclaim as holy convocations, and to bring an offering made by fire to Yah, a burnt offering, a grain offering, a sacrifice and drink offerings, each on its own day. Besides the Shabbats of Yah, your gifts, all of your vows, all of your voluntary offerings that you are to give to Yah. But on the 15th day of the seventh month, when you've gathered the produce of the land, you are to observe the festival of Yah for 7 days. This first day is to be a day of complete rest, and the 8th day is to be a day of complete rest. On the first day, you are to take choice fruit, palm fronds, fig branches, and river willows, and celebrate in the presence of Yah, your God, for 7 days. You are to observe it as a feast to Yah 7 days in the year. It is a permanent regulation, generation after generation. Keep it in the seventh month. You are to live in Sukkot for 7 days. Every citizen of Israel is to live in a sukkah, so that generation after generation you will know that I made the people of Israel live in Sukkot when I bring them out of the land of Egypt, for I am Yah your Elohim. So when we look at this initial description of this moed, this appointed time, we see that they're to build a sukkah. And specifically, what's interesting in verse 42, it talks about the citizen of Israel is to build a sukkah. And, there's some question that arises here. Well, what about those foreigners? And so I wanted to diverge a minute and look at a few verses. Because if we go to Exodus 12, in verse 48, this is talking about another one of the feasts, and this is talking about Passover. And it says, if a foreigner staying with you wants to observe Yah's Pesach, all of his males must be circumcised. Then he may take part and observe it. He will be like a citizen of the land, but no uncircumcised person is to eat it. The same teaching is applied equally to the citizen and the foreigner living among you. So here we see that Pesach includes the citizen and the foreigner. Okay, so let's go to Deuteronomy 16, and I'm going to start in verse 11. This is talking about Shavuot. And at Shavuot, it says, you are to rejoice in the presence of Yah your Elohim, you, your sons, your daughters, your male, female slaves, the Levi'im in your towns, your foreigners, the orphans, the widows, among you in the place where Yah your Elohim will choose to have his name live. So notice, even at Shavuot, is talking about you and your slaves and the foreigners. So we've got Passover talking about the foreigners, and we've got Shavuot talking about the foreigners. Well, if we skip over to the fall feast, we see, we did the teaching on Yom Teruah, that Yom Teruah is also talking about the day of the blasting of the shofar. And we don't really know a lot about why it's commanded, but I go into that in the previous teaching. But it is also a picture of Yeshua's return. And so when we think about Yeshua returning, in Revelation 1:7, it says, look, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, every eye. So that's everybody, okay? And at Yom Kippur, in Leviticus 16, it says that it is for the citizen and the foreigner with you. Okay, in Leviticus 16, verse 29, it says it is to be a permanent regulation for you. On that 10th day of the seventh month, you are to deny yourselves and do not do any kind of work, both the citizen and the foreigner living with you. So we've got, the previous feast that we're talking about. We've got here at the fall feast with Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur also talking about the foreigner. But when we get to Sukkot, it says in verse 42, Leviticus 23, verse 42, that every citizen of Israel is to live in a sukkah. Well, what about the foreigner? Why is there a difference? Because at Yom Kippur, we've got Israel and the foreigner. At Yom Teruah, we've got Israel and the foreigner. But when we get to Sukkot, we've only got Israel. It doesn't mention the foreigner. So why is there this distinction? And we got into a discussion about this. And, one of the things that came up is to think about, what do these false feasts represent? Yom Teruah, the second coming, everybody is going to see. Yom Kippur, the judgment. Judgment is for everyone. But when we get to Sukkot, Sukkot's about the eternal dwelling with Yah. And that is for his redeemed Israel. So, it's really interesting there. We don't see that. But when we take in the verse I read at the beginning in Numbers 15, it talks about the citizen there. And that word citizen is rak. And it's also, linked with the word tree. And so there was to be one Torah for the native as well as the foreigner. So if that person is coming in to be a citizen of Israel, they are to have equal rights. They are, no longer separate. And this got me to thinking about Ephesians chapter 2. So I'm going to go to Ephesians chapter 2, and I'm going to go to verse 11. It says, Paul wrote, "Therefore, remember your former state. You were Gentiles by birth, called uncircumcised by those who merely by the operation of their flesh are called circumcised." Well, who is that? That's us. We were Gentiles by birth, and it was a matter of the flesh. But then he says they also had no Messiah. So a Gentile had no Messiah. You were estranged from the national life of Israel. So you were not a part of Israel. You were foreigners to the covenant, to his covenant, his commands. You were foreigners to that. You weren't a part of that. You were in this world without hope and without Elohim. So a Gentile is a person that are estranged from Yah. They are not a person that is following Yah. They're not part of the covenant. They're not a part of Israel. They are separate. But look at verse 13. "But now you who were once far off have now been brought near through the shedding of the Messiah's blood. For he himself is our shalom, and he has made us both one and has broken down that veil that has divided us, that wall that's divided us." So when we think about what Messiah is doing here, he is bringing us together as one body. It is about being in unity. It is about being together. Yeshua and as Sukkot, it is about bringing these two groups into one renewed man. Well, when they're talking about this, when Paul is talking about this, who were the two groups that he's referring to? It's the two houses of Israel, because the house of Ephraim had went astray. Even Yeshua himself said that he only came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And so the house of Ephraim and the house of Yehuda, just like when we read in Ezekiel about the two sticks, and that's in Ezekiel chapter 37, and I'm going to go to verse 15. It says, "The word of Yah came to me, you, human being, take one stick and write on it for Yehuda and those joined with him from among the people of Israel. Next, take another stick and write on it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel who are joined with him. Finally, bring them together into a single stick so that they become one in your hand. And when the people ask what all of this means, tell them that Elohim says, I will take a stick from Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, together with the tribes of Israel who are joined with him, and put them together with the stick of Yehuda and make them into a single stick so that they become one in my hand." So these two sticks become one tree, Etzekad. And so Sukkot is about reuniting these two into one. It's about bringing them together and being in unity. And if, remember that this was a reminder of them coming out of Egypt and wandering in the wilderness. And if you think about when they first came out of Egypt, where did the children of Israel first go to when they left Egypt, when they left Ramses? Where did they go to? It was Sukkot. Exodus 12 and 37. The people of Israel traveled from Ramses to Sukkot, some 600,000 men on foot, not counting the children. And so that was their first stop. And it's it's about building this sukkah. And each generation builds their sukkah. And as they're building the sukkah, they're not only to remember, but they're to like relive the events of the wilderness wandering. It's to put yourself personally there. Even though you really weren't there, it is just so that you can remember and so that you can experience that same journey. Think about coming out of Egypt, coming out of that bondage. Think about spiritually coming out of that bondage, and you're now on your way to the promised land. And, it's, that reminder each Sukkot that each generation can remember who it is who brought them out and who it is that is sustaining them in the wilderness. Because, Yah provided for the children of Israel's every need in the wilderness. And so as we celebrate Sukkot, we're looking forward to living in the land of promise. And we're to remember how Yah sustains us daily. Now, I want to sort of diverge here for a little bit, because one of the things that I really looked at too is that, a land of promise. We are on the way to the promised land. We are on the way to that land of promise. And the land of promise is often referred to as America. And so if we think about this, on Monday, this Monday coming up for us is the holiday of Columbus Day here in America. And there are links between Sukkot and America. First of all, I know America wasn't discovered by Christopher Columbus, but historically, we know that there were others who had visited America long before that, but yet Columbus gets the recognition. And Yah knows everything. He knew what would happen, and he knew that, Columbus would get that credit. But when you start looking at some of the historical information, there are some clear indications that Christopher Columbus was Jewish. And, recently, there's like reputable newspapers like Rutgers and Independent News, the New York Post. There's other ones that have reported on Christopher Columbus because they do have, his bones where he was buried. And so they did DNA test on Columbus's bones. And those DNA tests revealed that Columbus had a Sephardic Jewish heritage. And so I will link that article, one of the articles, in the description box. Another interesting little side note about Columbus is that when he wrote a letter, he always made these little small marks on the top of his letter. And actually, they look, it was like the BH, which if you've seen any kind of Jewish letter or whatever, a lot of times they will put the bait with the apostrophe and then a hey. And these marks resemble like these Orthodox Jewish marks that they put in letters today, which stands for Baruch Hashem, bless his name. And Columbus not only wrote those on his letters, but he also, we know of for a fact, brought 5 Jews on his journey, including his translator, his navigator, the doctor, the surgeon, and the astronomer, all on that journey. So these were very important people on those. His maps were all written in Hebrew. He's the one who's leading this voyage, and he's looking at these maps and they're written in Hebrew. He has to be able to understand those too. Now, when did Columbus sail the ocean blue? 1492. So in 1492 is also a very important date, because that is when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain issued the Alhambra Decree, which forced the expulsion of Jews from Spain. And that was actually done on March the 31st, 1942. And so they gave them a time period to get out. And then it came like a cutoff, and they're like, you're going to have to convert or be killed. You're going to convert to Catholicism or be killed. And so the very day that Columbus was set to sail from Spain was August the 2nd. That was the last date for Jews to leave. August the 2nd, 1492. This date coincided on the calendar, the Hebrew calendar, with the ninth of Av. Now, the ninth of Av is the most ominous day in Jewish history, and Columbus delayed his journey by 1 day. He refused to leave on that day. And if you think about it, he's heading of this voyage. No matter who's on the ship with him, he is still the one responsible for, getting the ship to go. And yet he delayed it. Why? 1492 was the start of the Spanish Inquisition. Who else but a Jew would know and understand the importance of that date? Because that was the most ominous date in Jewish history. So if he's going off to, actually look for a new place, why is it that he won't sail on that date? It wouldn't make a hill of beans to anybody else except for a Jew, because this was the worst day in their history. This was the day that bad things happened. This was the day that the spies brought back the bad report. This was the day the first temple was destroyed. It was the same day the second temple was destroyed. So throughout history, we've seen other things happen on this date. And so even to this day, it's not a day that's going to be done where you're going to do a lot of business, or you're going to do things that are going to set into motion things for the future. And so the 9th of Av is not a good day. And he delayed his trip. The day that Columbus, ended up, because he left then on August the 3rd of 1492. Well, he ended up arriving landing in what was called the Americas on October the 12th, 1492. So looked it up on Hebrew now. What is October 12th, 1492? It was the 21st day of the month of Tishri, the 7th day of Sukkot. So the date that Christopher Columbus landed in what was called the Americas was the 7th day of Sukkot. And the 7th day of Sukkot is also known as Hoshana Rabbah, or the Great Sabbath. So he's got this ship that is bringing some Jews on it. And it was a day of great deliverance and miracles, because they were leaving Spain because of the Spanish Inquisition, whether you convert or die. And so on this Monday is Columbus Day. Banks are going to be closed. So do you know what this Monday is on the Hebrew calendar? Works out perfectly. It is also the 7th day of Sukkot, just as it was the year that Columbus landed in the Americas. And how appropriate is it that Columbus had Jews on board who arrived in the New World on the 7th day of Sukkot and being delivered from that Spanish Inquisition. Also interesting is when you start looking up some other information about Columbus, he wrote a lot about Zion, and he had a passion to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims, because during that time period, the Muslims were controlling Jerusalem. And a cultural anthropologist at Stanford University, Carol Delaney, she concluded that Columbus was a deeply religious man whose purpose was to sail to Asia to obtain gold, to finance a crusade, to take back Jerusalem, and to rebuild the Holy Temple. So, some interesting links there. Another interesting link tying with America is thinking about later we had the Pilgrims come. Okay. And so the first Thanksgiving happened in November. It's one of our fall feasts in America, and it happened in November of 1621. And it seemed to have many similarities with Sukkot, but what's even a greater interest when you start looking at the Pilgrims, and before, they were coming, they were very religious, but they lived amongst the Sephardic Jews in Holland for a decade before leaving to come for America. And they would have been very familiar with some of the details of how they celebrated their fall feast. And, William Bradford, who was one of the leaders of the Pilgrims, when they arrived and they got here, one of the things that he did was he recited Psalms 107, which was a prayer from the Mishnah Torah that is actually right during Sukkot. And the Thanksgiving meal was eaten outdoors, and it didn't last for one day, but it lasted for several days that we know of historically. Now, whatever the case, firmly, whether Thanksgiving is actually a Sukkot or not, there are lots of links there. Whatever the case, I believe there's a great historical evidence that there were ancient Hebrews in America prior to Christopher Columbus. Remember, we've talked about this before, that the Decalogue stone, which was written with Paleo Hebrew, was found. I think it's in New Mexico. The ancient copper mines that were in the Midwest were depleted during King Solomon's day. That links during this same time period of the Phoenicians that I've taught on previously. And, so it's all these links that there were people that were here of that Hebrew origin. Now, since I'm tying it in with our fall feast here in America being Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving is about what? Praising Yah. And it's also known by many names. It's also called Turkey Day. And turkey in Hebrew is hodu, which is also the Hebrew word for giving thanks. Hodu ladonai ki tov, ki leolam hasto. Psalms 136 and verse 1, which is give thanks to Yah, for he is good, for his grace continues forever. So it's interesting that we have that word hodu linked with Thanksgiving. Now, we're commanded to build a sukkah. So just to share some pictures with you of a sukkah and what they look like in some of the pictures. These are just some pictures that we've had previously done at some sukkahs. So I want to share. So of course, that's just me in a sukkah right here. And then we also have, this was a sukkah that I built at our school when I was teaching in Jerusalem. And this is a sukkah at one of the Sukkot celebrations in Israel, and one on the street. This is actually one that's right there at one of my favorite falafel shops. So I just wanted to share some of those with you so that you can see they're very simple. And a lot of times you can make them extravagant or not, but when the children of Israel left Egypt and they wandered the desert, really they weren't militarily prepared. They had women, they had children with them, they had elderly with them, and they're going through this wilderness. So therefore they've got animals, and they've got the heat, they've got the cold at night, they've got bandits, so all of these elements, wind, whatever, the sharab, the windstorms that come along. So, and they were traveling most of the time. A lot of times they were in a place, they would be in a place for a couple of days or whatever, and then they might move, or they might be there for a month. And then sometimes they were there for a year or so. So while they were traveling, Yah instructed them to build these flimsy temporary booths, which is called a sukkah. Sukkot is the plural. And, for the children of Israel, these Sukkot hardly provided any protection from the elements. And, actually we have a prophecy in Isaiah that shows us that there's this lack of protection that is linked with a sukkah. So if we go to Isaiah chapter 1, verse 7, says, your land is desolate. Your cities are burned to the ground. Foreigners devour your land in your presence. It's as desolate as if overwhelmed by floods. The daughter of Zion is left like a shack in a vineyard, like a shed in a cucumber field, like a city under siege. That word shack is the word sukkah. So the daughter of Zion, Jerusalem, is like a sukkah. And so it's this picture here, this, lesson that's being taught to us that safety and security doesn't come from having these thick walls of your house or having burglar alarms or having cameras on your home, but it comes from the trust and reliance in Yah. In other words, if Yah is for us, it doesn't matter what kind of shelter we have will suffice. If he is there, going to be there with us. But if Yah is against us, then it doesn't matter what kind of shelter we have, because nothing is going to protect us from Yah. And, so he's telling us too, remember, you are a sukkah. You are a temporary dwelling. You're to be a temple. You're a temporary dwelling. We need to remember that it is Yah that sustains us daily, providing what we need, or to be seeking shelter from Him. Now, what's also interesting is during the Hol Moed, these are the intermediate days. That means it's not the first day of Sukkot and it's not the last day of Sukkot. So in those intermediate days, the Haftorah portion, the prophet portion that is read usually comes from Ezekiel chapter 38, starts in verse 18 and goes through Ezekiel 39, verse 16. And so when you look at Ezekiel 38 and 39, this portion is talking about the end time battle of Gog and Magog. And Gog means mountain. And so, it's really interesting because, wait a minute, we're in a time that's called the season of our rejoicing. And we're reading about this end time battle we're confronting this mountain. And what's the connection here? Because the root of that word Gog is actually Gag, which is roof. We can see that used in 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 26. They got up early, and about daybreak, Shmuel called out to Shaul on the roof, "Get up so I can send you on your way." And Shaul got up, and both of them, he and Shmuel, went out. So he was sleeping on the roof. Well, this roof here is a solid surface. It was a source of security. And that is a direct contrast with the sukkah, because in that sukkah, you look up and, we look through ours, we've got tree limbs across it, and you see the stars. It's weak, it's flimsy. We were sitting out there today and the wind was blowing and things were coming around and leaves and stuff were falling down on us as we were eating. And, so it's flimsy. It's a temporary covering. And it basically doesn't have a roof. It's going to shelter you a little bit from the sun, but the sun was still coming through. And this is a contrast with the world, because the world is really trying to make themselves safe and secure. They're building these strong walls, and they don't realize where their true power is from, that the true power is only from Yah. And so Ezekiel 38 and also in Zechariah 14, they're both linked with Sukkot. And it's about remembering who is our source. And this is the, one feast that everyone from the nations are going to come up every year to worship the King, is that Sukkot. And, so it's, who are we putting our trust in? Are we putting our trust in our money, in our jobs, in our own hands? Yet this feast, again, is about this temporary dwelling. He's trying to show us that He is the source. He will provide for us. And so this is not only a reminder of the past, but it's also a promise for the end time. So He is our source. And the war of Gog and Magog is a battle of the root, so to speak. It's the battle of the roof against the sukkah. Where are we placing our trust? Are we placing our trust in the things of this world? Or are we placing our trust in the sukkah and Yah's protection? And so that's that contrast. And this is a holiday that we're commanded to rejoice. Well, wait a minute. it's linked with the end time battle. So why should we rejoice in the midst of battle? Why should we rejoice when these trials and these tribulations are coming our way? And it's because we know that no matter what, our safety lies in Yah alone. So if you're feeling like you've got these battles coming against you, um, and these trials coming against you, this is a time to rejoice in Him and to know that He has it in His hands and He's got you in His hands. Deuteronomy 16, verse 13. You are to keep the festival of Sukkot for 7 days after you've gathered the produce of your threshing floor and winepress. Rejoice at your festival, you, your sons, your daughters, your male and female slaves, the Levi'im, the foreigners, the orphans, the widows living among you. 7 days you are to keep the festival for Yah, your Elohim, in the place which Yah will choose, because Yah, your Elohim, will bless you in all of your crops and all your work, so you will be full of joy. 3 times a year, all of your men are to appear in the presence of Yah, your Elohim, in the place which He will choose, at the festival of Matzah, at the festival of Shavuot, and at the festival of Sukkot. They are not to show up before Yah empty-handed, but every man is to give what he can in accordance with the blessing that Yah has given you. So how do we fulfill this? Here we are in America, and can we go and bring our offerings before Yah? We're living here currently in America, it's difficult to fully obey this command, and we can't really because there's not a temple. So we're obeying to the best of our ability here. And it says you're not to come before Him empty-handed. And one of the things I still believe that in blessing the physical land and the physical people that are there in Israel. And so this is why for us at this time of year, we always make sure that we send one of our offerings to the land of Israel and land of Jerusalem at this time. So this is a time of rejoicings. Zaman Simhatenu. And so think about this. The sages teach that rejoicing is only rejoicing when it's shared, because it's only true joy is shared joy. To fully rejoice, it's not really done alone a lot of times. And that's why, for those who don't have a fellowship, who don't have a group that can get together and meet, it's very difficult at this time. And, it's important that we invite guests. The Aramaic word for guest is ushpazim. And so in tradition, you are to invite guests to come into your sukkah. And it's, we're opening up our sukkah, not only to those physical guests, but it's taught that you're opening them up to one of the 7 shepherds of Israel that are no longer with us. They're like spiritual guests. That doesn't mean that you're talking or communing with dead spirits. No, we're not into that. It is just taught that on each one of those nights that you're inviting one of those forefathers, the spirit that they exhibited, the fruits of the spirit that they exhibited, that you are really wanting that to come into your life. You're going to dwell on it, and that you are going to try to walk that out in the following year. So these guests that, they're talking about that are coming in, your forefathers are Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Moshe, Aaron, Joseph, and David. And so on each night, a different one of these is singled out in order. And like I said, these are pictures too of the fruits of the Spirit. So in Galatians 5:22, it talks about the fruit of the Spirit being love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness, humility and self-control. It says nothing in the Torah stands against such things. So when we look at the qualities or these fruits that these forefathers are displaying on the first night is Abraham, and he's said to display love, ahava. On the second day is Yitzhak, which is about self-control. Shlita Atzmi. So, Abraham went to sacrifice Yitzhak and he had to have self-control. He's a grown man and going to submit himself to being, killed here. Yaakov displayed tiferet, or beauty and truth. Moshe is said to display nitzak, or victory and faithfulness. Aharon displayed Avanah, humility. And then Yosef was displaying holiness and kindness. And David is said to display the establishment of the kingdom. So, and those were just a few of the qualities there. But as we invite guests into our sukkah, we're not only inviting those people and trying to introduce them into some of this and sharing in our joy, but it's also about inviting the fruits of the Spirit to be displayed and shown through our lives. And so let us strive to take on the gifts of the Spirit imparted by those shepherds into our hearts, and let our lives this coming year exhibit those fruits, to live them out. So it's not only for that, but it's the Sukkot is for the nations. When you start going through in Numbers 29, it talks about the offerings that are made during Sukkot. And the first offering is a young bull. And during Sukkot, when you look at them, there are 70 bulls that are offered. And 70 is in connection with the nations, because it talks about in Deuteronomy 32:8 that when Yah gave out each nation its heritage, that he divided them according to the nations of Israel's population, which had 70 descendants that came out of Egypt. And so that's how they get the 70 there. And so another fascinating thing about Sukkot is when you look at these offerings here, there are a total of 70 bulls, 14 rams, 98 lambs. So that's 182 sacrifices. Each one of those numbers is divisible by 7. Yah's perfection. And when you take the total number of sacrifices here for Sukkot, 182, and divide it by 7, you get 26, which is the number of Yah's name, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And so this 7-day feast holiday takes place in the 7th month. His perfection is imprinted on all of the sacrifices, and they are for all nations. So when we look at this, this pattern of the 7th year, it's the 7-day festival. It's in the 7th month. It is his perfection on all of those sacrifices, because each one of those are divisible by 7, and it's representing the 70 nations. Okay. Now, Leviticus 23 and verse 40. During Sukkot, it says that on the first day, you were to take choice fruit, palm fronds, fig branches, and river willows, and celebrate in the presence of Yah your Elohim for 7 days. So there's 4 species that are mentioned. These are called Arba Minim, and these 4 species represent, what they say are types of people. And in Jerusalem, there is great inspection of these species that are made by the Orthodox. Just so I can show you, I'm going to share a picture here. Let me go there just a second, because I want to share the screen just so you can see a few of these pictures. Okay, so these are just some pictures of going around at the Shuk Mahane Yehuda and walking, and you can see as they're preparing for Sukkot, you've got this picture of them looking for the etrog, and then you've got laid out the different branches, the willows. They're here definitely inspecting those. This is the etrog, the citron, okay, and how it looks. So that is representing, they go through great detail because they're wanting them to not have a blemish or anything. They're wanting them to, represent people. Okay. And so these 4 are said to represent 4 types of people. The citron or that etrog, is very tasty. It is a lot like a lemon. It has a lot of bumps on it, and they use this actually after Sukkot to make like a jam or jelly, and it's a very pleasant aroma. And it's, it represents the righteous people who have both the Torah and the word, the knowledge, and good deeds. So it's very tasty, has a pleasant smell, and it's got good fruit. The second, the lulav, that's where they take these three branches: the branch of a date palm, the branch of something sweet fruit, as well as a willow. So they're taking these three and they bind them together. And so when you look at these, the lulav, the date palm here is, it produces fruit as the palm, the dates. And date palms don't really have a aroma or fragrance. So this was representing the person who has knowledge of the Torah, such as a scholar, but really they're lacking in those good deeds. He's deficient in his good works. And then the other part of the lulav, that other one besides the date palm, is the hasidim, which is the myrtle. Okay, these are all plants that would have been native in Israel. And the myrtles have a sweet smelling aroma. And this is a picture of people who have good deeds, but they don't really have, fruit. They don't really have the knowledge of the Torah. So they're deficit in the knowledge. So it's the opposite of the first one. And this is, a lot of times I think where the majority of people tend to fall. So a lot of people tend to maybe do good things, but they really don't know a lot about the Torah. And then finally, there's the willow. And the willow is called arvot. And it has to grow near water. It needs that water. And the willow doesn't really have a smell. It's odorless, it's tasteless. And it's basically representing people who are lacking both knowledge and good deeds. They've got potential, they're a tree, they can do stuff, but they have neither. And so what's interesting is in Judaism, they take all of these and they bring them together and they're way before Yah. And this is also a picture of the ingathering, the whole world coming together and being waved or presented before Yah. And, of course, it's waved in all directions, up, down, front and back, left and right. And so it was representing that all the people are coming from all nations at this holiday. And if you think about us, as here we are believers, that we're coming from all parts of the world to worship Yah. Just like these four species here. Now, Sukkot was also special for other reasons, because you think about while the children of Israel were capable of reading and writing, books were really rare and were expensive during that time. That's why you had only a lot of times, like the very rich or something like that, you would have libraries. Like the Library of Alexandria, you would have, these big prominent libraries where they would keep certain books. Unlike today, most believers, you can't go to their house and they have not one, but they have multiple Bibles to look at. And so in ancient times, they didn't have that. So for one of the things that happened at Sukkot was that the Torah was read publicly, especially every 7 years. Now, during, those other years up to the seventh year, you had Levitical cities that were established, and that, you had the priests around, and that they would be able to read, and you would go to the synagogue and they would teach you. And so they would hear, but they didn't hear all of it. It was more or less you're hearing a sermon. And so in Deuteronomy 31 and verse 10, it says, Moshe gave them these orders. At the end of every 7 years, during the festival of Sukkot, in the year of Shemitah, when all of Israel will have come to appear in the presence of Yah at the place he will choose, you are to read this Torah before all of Israel so that they can hear it. Assemble the people, the men, the women, the little ones, and the foreigners you have in your town so that they can hear, learn, fear Yah. and take care to obey all the words of this Torah. And so they and their children who have not known can hear and learn to fear Yah, your Elohim, for as long as you live in the land, you are crossing Yarden to possess. So this is another reason it's important during Sukkot is the reading of the word. So this should be of importance as you're celebrating your Sukkah. It's not just a glorified camping trip. It is about focusing too on his word. Now, there were specific offerings and ceremonies that took place during Sukkot, especially during the temple days. And, one of the most important, the most wondrous, wondrous for one, how amazing would it be if we could actually be there and see these ceremonies taking place in the temple and see what Yeshua saw, because he went to the temple. He saw these ceremonies taking place. One of the most exceptional ones that's recorded is called Simchat Beit Hashovah, which is rejoicing at the house of the water drawing, or the water libation ceremony, because each morning of Sukkot, a water libation, or a pouring out of water, was offered to Yah. And this was a visual prayer for rain, because you got to remember, Israel is a desert country. Water is vital, and you really don't get rain in Israel except during what's called the rainy season, which is usually, it starts at Sukkot and it usually goes to March. Sometimes you can get some in April, and but it's not like it's raining all the time for raining season. It's like that's when you're going to get rain. So usually the rest of the year you're not carrying an umbrella at all. But it was a visual, pouring out the water was a visual prayer for rain. But I want to look at the ceremony in detail, because one of the things that is recorded that happens here is that the high priest, the Kohen Hagadol, would go down to the pool of Shiliach, which the pool Shiliach means sent one, and he would go with a procession of musicians and worshipers, and they would go down to this pool, and the high priest would carry this golden pitcher, and he would put it in the water and dip it in the water and fill it up and bring it back to the Temple Mount each morning. Okay. And so as he reached the southern gate of the temple, and it was called the water gate, and it's called the water gate because what's he doing? He's bringing the water in that gate. He would enter, and they would do 3 blasts on the silver trumpets that would sound right outside the temple. And the priests, they heard those blasts, they would shout out in one, loud voice, the words of Isaiah 12:3. This says, "Then you will joyfully draw water from the wells of salvation." And so they are proclaiming that because he's bringing in the water. And so bringing in water from the sent one, how much is that a picture of Yeshua? He was the sent one, and he is the living water. And so at the same time they were going down there, there was another procession that would go to the south of Jerusalem to what's actually called Motzah. And that is where there was willows along the brook, and that's where they would grow along the water, and they would actually gather up these thin, long, thin willows, and they would bring them back to the temple. And as they're coming back, they are waving them like a lulav with a bouquet of palm and willow and myrtle branches. And as they're coming back, they're singing psalms. They're singing Psalms 113 through 118. And they would be accompanied by trumpet blast and musical instruments, and as they proceeded to the temple, and they're waving this big lulav of willow branches and palm branches and myrtle branches, and it's making this whooshing noise, and basically it's the sound of wind, or the ruach. And this procession, and when they would get there, they would actually circle the altar. Okay. And then the priest would pour out water from the pitcher on the western half of the altar. And it had an open drain, and it had like a twin tube silver bowl on the south side of the altar. He would pour wine. Okay. And so he would pour out the wine and he would pour out the water and he would do it at the same time. And this was a picture, really of, you've got the spirit that's coming in, it's making that swooshing noise, but you also have the water and the wine here. Well, after the Shabbat of the first day, the priest would actually go out and they would light these huge lamps in the courtyard of the women. Because remember, there's a certain courtyard that the women could go in, you could go into, but then they couldn't go any farther. Okay. And so these huge lamps, they were tall, they were really, really tall. They would actually hold, they had in each one, they had 4 lamps on each of the corners, and each bowl on them would hold about 7 to 8 gallons of oil each. And they would put these wicks in these big bowls. And these wicks were made from the worn out garments of the priest's clothing, if they've gotten damaged or they've got dirty, whatever. These were the worn out garments. And so they would tear them up and they would use them in these 4 bowls that would make this like candelabra. And the worn out garments of these priests were called swaddling clothes, because they're swaddling them together. And all the men then would be dancing around and singing in this great celebration, and it would last into the night. So I want to just quickly show you a picture here of what that would look like. Let me see right here. Hopefully I haven't been showing that the whole time. Yes. So here we go. So this is, like, you can see the candelabra here. This is in the daytime, and then they would light them at the night. And, there were 4, on the top of this pole, there's these 4 big, bowls, and they were filled with 7 to 8 gallons of oil. And children would actually climb the ladder usually, because the adults, the older we get, don't like heights as much. And so these little kids would climb up and would take the pitchers of oil in their hands and pour it into each basin. And they would take those wicks and, put them in there. And like I said, that they would light them. And it was said that the light was so bright that it not only illuminated the courtyard here, but it illuminated all the way down through the city of David, that it was so bright and there was nothing like this seen anywhere else. So just to share that with you. But think about how this links with Yeshua. Because if we go to Luke chapter 2, at Yeshua's birth, I'm going to go down to verse 7. And it says, and she gave birth to her first child, Miriam, a son. And she wrapped him in a cloth and laid him in a feeding trough, because there was no space for them in the living quarters. Now, what's interesting here is that, remember what she's wrapping him in a cloth. And some versions said it's a swaddling cloth. Okay. And when you look at these garments here, these priestly garments, remember, you think about, how would she get priestly garments? How would she get the swaddling cloth? Who's her cousin? Elizabeth. Who's Elizabeth's husband? Zachariah, who was what? A priest. Okay. So notice here that she is wrapping him in these swaddling cloths. And when we think about too, how this is another link with Yeshua, because he is going to be our high priest, that his garments, think about when he was getting ready to be crucified, they put a garment on him. Okay. Remember what happened to the garments at the temple? That, they are divided into 4 pieces, because they're used for the 4 lamps in the courtyard that were to be lit for that water libation ceremony. Now, John chapter 19, verse 23 says, when the soldiers had nailed Yeshua to the stake, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 shares, a share for each soldier. 4. And with the underrobe left over. Now the underrobe was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So Yeshua's garment was divided into 4 parts, just like the priest's garment was divided into 4 parts to be put into those lamps to be a wick that would light up the whole area, temple area, all the way, not only down to the city of David, but they even said as far as Bethlehem. Josephus writes that you could even see it as far as Bethlehem. And so, and during that time, they would have all night dancing and rejoicing that was taking place in the courtyard of the women. And the Levites would sing songs, and they would have their musicians that would keep the music and stuff going until the morning. And in the morning, the Levites would, stood on the 15 steps that led down to the Israelites' courtyard. And this is where they would sing the Shir Hamalot, the Song of Ascents, which are Psalms 120 through 134. And there are 15 steps there. And it's interesting that 15, Yud, Hey, is the first part of Yah's name. And so this procession, the same procession would happen each day. This was this visual prayer for rain until we get to the last day. On the seventh day, there was a change that was made. And on the seventh day, the priest, instead of just circling the altar one time, would circle it 7 times, singing with a loud voice. And they would cry out Psalms 118, verse 25. Please, Yah, save us. Please, Yah, rescue us. Hoshiana, Shlihana. So it was, Yah, save us. Please save us. And so this is where we get the name Hoshana Rabbah for this day. It was the great save us. And it's linked with the waters. Okay, and it's also linked with the Ruach because they're bringing these branches, swooshing them. And Isaiah 44 and verse 3 says, I will pour waters out on thirsty land and streams on the dry ground, and I will pour my spirit on your descendants and my blessing on your offspring. So there's that wonderful promise there. Now, there at the altar, on the sides of the altar, like I said, they would pour the water in on one side and the wine in on the other. Well, water and wine don't have the same viscosity. They're not going to flow at the same rate. And yet the protrusions, were perforated so that the wine and water, one side was a little narrow and one side was a little bigger, so that they would actually get to the bottom at the exact same time. Now think about how this picture plays out. When Yeshua hung on the tree, the soldier came around to break his legs in order for him to die faster. And in John 19, verse 32, it says, the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first man who had been put on a stake beside Yeshua, then the legs of the other one. But when they got to Yeshua, they saw that he was already dead, and they didn't break his legs. However, one of the soldiers stabbed his side with a spear, and at once blood and water flowed out. And when the soldier got to Yeshua, he was dead. So he pierced his side, and noticed that blood and water came out. Blood and water represented, like, the blood is the wine. It's a picture of the wine and the water. So at his death, just like the priest would have poured out the blood, the wine and the water at the same time, and they mix, they come out at the exact same time. Here we have Yeshua, his body, the blood and the water pouring out. And it's that same picture of that water libation ceremony that took place here at the end of Sukkot. The water brings life, and water in Hebrew is mayim. And what did Yeshua say he was? He said he was the living water. And if we go to John chapter 7, verse 37, look at when this is happening. Now, on the last day of the festival, Hoshana Rabbah, Yeshua stood and cried out, if anyone is thirsty, let him keep coming to me and drinking. Whoever puts his trust in me, as the scripture says, rivers of living water will flow from his innermost being. It was on the last day. the seventh day here of Sukkot, that he says, I'm the living water. He was the Mayim from Hashemayim. He is the water from the heavens. In heaven in Hebrew is Hashemayim. So it's interesting that the play there was that, and Hashemayim is actually made up of two parts, Sham, there, and Mayim, water. It's the water there. And, others also see it as Esh, fire, and Mayim, water. So, some see it as Hashemayim being Esh, fire and water. And so others look at the word Hashemayim being Shem and Mayan. That Shem means name, and that's what the rabbis use to refer to, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, is thus the water is coming from God. So whatever two words you use to make up Hashemayim, it is when we mix the water and the blood of Yeshua, we have that eternal life here. And so that's what Sukkot is about. Yah one day is going to dwell with us, and we're going to have eternity with him. And it's a time that, he's going to be pouring out those waters, just like, we read in Isaiah 12. He says, on that day you will say, I thank you, Yah, because although you were angry at me, your anger is now turned away and you are comforting me. See, God is my salvation. I am confident and unafraid, for Yah is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. Then you will joyfully draw water from the springs of salvation. So, like I said, no matter what's going on in your life, how much we think we're in a desert place, how alone we feel, we still have hope in Yah. And at this time, of year, it's about rejoicing in him, seeing that symbolism that he's trying to show us, that relying not on ourselves, but relying on him, and seeing that picture of the water libation ceremony and being in the life of Yeshua, and, praise him and don't be afraid. And because Yah is your strength, he is our song. And, it is a great hope for us. So as we are celebrating this time of rejoicing, the Zaman Simhatenu, it is a rejoicing in the blessing and of our increase and in Yah. And so we've got so many pictures in the Sukkah alone and in Sukkot and what he's trying to show us. But I do want to end with one other thing about Yeshua, is what is all this about? It's about Yah sitting down and dwelling with us. Okay. How is he going to do that? And we look at John 1:14, it talks about that the Word became a human being and lived among us, and we saw his Shekinah, the Shekinah of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. So that word Shekinah, Shekan means to dwell. So, a lot of translations will actually use the word that he dwelt with us. But it also means, to tent or tabernacle or sukkah with us. So he's going to sukkah with us. And we think about, how is he going to do that? He is, sending his son to do that. And in Luke 1, verse 26, we think about, it says here that in the 6th month that the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a city in the Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin engaged to a man named Joseph of the house of David. The virgin's name was Miriam. So Miriam is actually conceiving when Elizabeth, her cousin, is 6 months pregnant. And Elizabeth, we know, is the mother of John. John is going to be then 6 months older than Yeshua. So by looking at John's birth, we can get a timing of Yeshua's birth. In Luke 1 and verse 5, It says, in the days of Herod, the king of Yehuda, there was a Cohen named Zechariah who belonged to Abiyah division, and his wife was a descendant of Aharon, and her name was Elisheva. So Zechariah presented himself for temple duty. Well, how did he know when to go? We look at this and we're like, well, it doesn't give us a time here, but he was a Levite, a priest. And it tells us he was at the division of Abiyah. Okay, well, if we go to First Chronicles chapter 24, this outlines the divisions of the priest for us. And there are 24 groups. And if we think about how many weeks there are in a year, 24 groups are each serving 2 weeks out of the year. And so we go down the list, and in verse 10, it says the 7th was for Hakutz, the 8th for Abiyah. So Abiyah was the 8th division here. So how do we know when to start counting? Exodus 12 tells us when the year starts. Exodus 12 and 1 says, you're going to begin your calendar in this month. It's going to be the first year. He's talking about when they get ready to come out of Egypt, a Passover, Aviv. So according to scripture, the month that Passover falls in is to be the beginning of months for you. Okay, so Passover usually falls maybe, mid-March or early April. So if you're counting up 2 weeks for each group until you get to the 8th group, that would be Abiyah's turn, and that would put it around late June. So looking at Luke 1:24, Elizabeth then would have conceived around late June because, Zechariah was in the temple, he come home, and then she conceived. Okay, so, but it's the Miriam. So if we count June plus 6 months to get when she conceived, because, John's going to be 6 months. She was 6 months pregnant when Miriam conceived. That would have been around December to get their birth. So if John was conceived in June, had 9 months, that means he would have been born around April. Yeshua would have been conceived in December. December is Hanukkah, the light of the world. He was the light of the world being conceived. Okay. But he would have been born 9 months later. That would have been put around September or October, depending on how the weeks fall. And so to emphasize this point, think about that here is Yeshua. He is going to Sukkah with us. Okay. He was literally, I believe, born in a Sukkah. Okay. During the Feast of Sukkot, because he was placed in a manger where the animals were kept. Well, we can go back to scripture and see where animals were kept. In Genesis 33 and 17, it says Yaakov went to Sukkot where he built himself a house and he put up shelters for his animals, his cattle. This is why he called the place Sukkot. So that word booth or shelter is Sukkah. So the reason he called it that place was because he built a Sukkah there. Okay. And when we see that Luke 2 and 7, that Miriam gave birth to her first child, a son, she wrapped him in the feeding trough. There was animals there. It was a place to feed them because there was no space in the inn or the living quarters. Well, if this happened in December around Christmas, you're not going to have shepherds out in the fields in December. It's the rainy season here. But when would be a time that you would have a lot of people there, that there wouldn't be room in the inn, is around the feast days. Because people, even today, from around the world come to Jerusalem to celebrate Sukkot, just as the word commands. And, if you're going to Israel at a feast, you have to really book way in advance. Usually people are at the feast now are booking for next year's feast because they know how hard it is to get a place to stay because they book up very quickly. So just think about how this all ties together with the timing of his birth. And I believe, this is just me personally, but I believe that his birth took place on the first day of Sukkot. Because I just look at the pattern. If this happened on the 15th day of the month, of the first day of Sukkot is the 15th of Tishri, that remember that a baby boy would be circumcised 8 days later. Okay. And we know that Yeshua was circumcised on the eighth day, because in Luke 2:21 it says, on the eighth day, when it was time for his Brit Milah, his circumcision, he was given the name Yeshua. Okay. So if he was born on the 15th, then that meant that his circumcision would have been on the eighth day, which is Simchat Torah, or rejoicing in the Torah. And that is the time when you would roll back the scroll and have a new beginning. And on Simchat Torah, all the Torah scrolls are taken out of the ark and they're paraded 7 times around the bema, the pulpit area, or down the hall or the street or whatever, and they're paraded around, and it is a great rejoicing that's done. And so you think about, if Yeshua was born on the first day, then for 7 days you're basically having this Sukkot, you're having this festival, but on the 8th day you're rejoicing in him. So are we called to celebrate his birth? Not necessarily, but yes, we are. If his birth is Sukkot, and then we are rejoicing in him being the living Torah. He is the living Torah. He is the living word. And in the future, it talks about in Revelation 21:3 about the New Jerusalem coming down and descending like a sukkah over the people. And it says that in 21 in verse 3, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, see, God's Shekinah is with mankind, and he will live with them, and they will be his people, and he himself, with God with them, and will be their God. And, we've got this rehearsal that we're doing now by us practicing or trying to celebrate Sukkot. We're basically doing a rehearsal for the wedding feast. Revelation 19:7. Let us rejoice and be glad. Let us give him glory. For the time has come for the wedding of the Lamb, and the bride has prepared herself. Fine linen, bright and clean, has been given to her to wear. And it says, fine linen is the righteous deeds of his people. And the angel said to me, write, how blessed are those who have been invited to the wedding feast of the Lamb. And then he added, these are God's very words. And so here we've got a picture of Yeshua's birth, and not only his birth, but it's also a picture of God dwelling with us. And when we get to spend eternity with him, that it is going to be forever. So, like I said, there's so much symbolism and details about Sukkot, and we can barely just scratch the surface. But as we celebrate, let's remember the joy of the living water and all of the rich parables that come along with this teaching, and to, take hope that one day, he has got everything in control, and that our source is in him and him alone. It is not by our might or our strength. It is only by his spirit. So may God bless you and keep you, and may you have a great Sukkot Hag Sameach.